Good afternoon, dear colleagues and guests. Today is the 16th of December 2020 at 3 p.m. Moscow time. Let me declare open a session of the Dissertation Council for the terms of thesis by Rozov, Vladimir, and Andreevich for the degree of candidate of Philology, specialty 10-0222, languages of foreign nations of Europe, Asia, Africa, aborigines of America and Australia, Arabic, on the theme Arabic rhyme, prose, and religious and ritual texts of pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabia. By the order of St. Petersburg University of the 25th of September 2020, number 8531/1, me, Zheltov Alexander Yurovich, Doctor of Philology, Associate Professor, Professor Head of the Department of African Studies at St. Petersburg University, was appointed Chairman of this Dissertation Council. Other members of the Dissertation Council were appointed with the same order. Let me introduce them to you. Present here we have Yefim Anatolovich Rezvan, Doctor of History, Professor, Head of Research Direction of the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography of Russian Academy of Sciences. He's also Editor-in-Chief of Manuscript Orientalia Journal. In remote access mode, we have Mikhail Sergeyevich Pelevin, Doctor of Philology, Professor, Head of the Department of Iranian Philology. Dear colleagues, I have to announce a technical break. Sorry.
Да, я слушаю.
Миша, отключи микрофон.
Микрофон отключить?
Отключи.
Все хорошо. Все, можем продолжать, извините. Все, да, все, спасибо.
Let's continue, please. Dear colleagues, the technical break is over, and let us continue our session. So, I introduced Yefim Anatolovich Rezvan. Let me continue the introduction. Also in the remote access mode, we have Mikhail Sergeyevich Pelevin, Doctor of Philology, Professor, Head of the Department of Iranian Philology of St. Petersburg University. Mikhail Anatolovich Rodionov, Doctor of History, Professor, Chief Researcher of the South and Southwest Asia Department of Peter the Great Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography of Russian Academy of Sciences, St. Petersburg. Also, Yakov Marcus Hermin Antila, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of Edinburgh University, UK. Dear colleagues, working in the remote access mode today, can you all see and hear us? Please say yes or no. We need to make sure that you are present and that you can hear us. Mikhail Sergeyevich, yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. Mikhail Anatolovich. Mikhail Anatolovich, please say, please. Mikhail Anatolovich. Yes, I can see and hear you. Okay. Very well, thank you. Professor Hamin Antila, please say, please confirm if you can hear us.
Yes, thank you. I can hear and see.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the answer is positive. All the colleagues are present. We are online. Also, the degree applicant, Vladimir Andreevich Rozov, is present. Also, in the remote access mode, we have the academic advisor of the applicant, Redkin Oleg Ivanovich, Doctor of Philology, Professor of the Arabic Philology Department of St. Petersburg University. To improve the quality of connection, I invite you, dear colleagues working in the remote access mode, to keep your microphones switched off, but please remember to switch them on when you are given the floor. Let me also inform you that our session is being recorded and broadcast online at St. Petersburg University website. The speeches are being translated from Russian into English or from English into Russian. During the live broadcast of the council session, at the moment an email is displayed to which all the listeners may send their opinions and questions to the degree applicant online regarding his thesis and the current scientific discussion of his speech. These questions shall be forwarded to me by our technical support department, and I shall read them during the discussion. Questions should be related to the applicant's speech and the content of his thesis, and it's necessary to indicate full name, position, and place of employment of the author. Questions that are not related to the scientific discussion of the thesis, the text and assessment of the thesis shall not be presented. In accordance with the order of awarding academic degrees of Doctor of Science and Candidate of Science approved by the local regulation of St. Petersburg University, hereinafter referred to as the order, a session of the Decision Council shall be considered competent if at least 2/3 of the approved members are present, but not less than 4 persons. Our council consists of 5 persons. All 5 are present, including 3 council members in the remote interactive mode. The audiovisual contact has been established with all the council members and the degree applicant. Thus, we have the quorum. Let me set forth the following procedure of today's session of the council with the total duration of approximately 2 hours. First, Chairman's summary report on documents submitted by the applicant and their compliance with applicable regulations. Answers to possible questions, approximately 5 minutes. Summary report of the degree applicant outlining the key findings of his study, approximately 20 minutes. Questions to the applicant strictly on his report, no more than 2 minutes for each question. Answers of the degree applicant, no more than 10 minutes for all answers. Speeches of all members of the Decision Council in turn with their assessment of the thesis, and the applicant's speech with a summary of their positions, questions and suggestions to the degree applicant, approximately 10 minutes for each speaker. Speech of the chairman with his assessment of the dissertation, approximately 10 minutes. Answers of the applicant to questions and remarks made by the Dissertation Council members, no more than 20 minutes. Open discussion. Attendees are welcome to speak with summaries of their positions and specific questions and suggestions to the applicant strictly on the theme of his study, no more than 2 minutes for each speaker. At that, other speakers are kindly requested to register in the registration sheet and to introduce themselves fully before speaking. 9. The chairman shall present questions to the applicant sent during the discussion at St. Petersburg University website. Answers of the applicant, no more than 2 minutes per each question. Speech of the academic advisor, no more than 3 minutes. Discussion of the Dissertation Council members before the open voting of the defense results. For that period, sound shall be switched off. Individual open voting. Votes shall be counted by the chairman and the results shall be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. Making decision on awarding or not awarding the degree to the applicant. Closing remarks of the applicant, no more than 2 minutes. Dear colleagues, do you have questions or objections to this procedure? Since there are no objections, there seem to be no objections, let us start the official procedure. Please remember to switch off your cell phones, but keep them switched on. Let us start the session with the chairman's summary report. A thesis by Rozov, Vladimir Andreevich for the degree of Candidate of Philology, specialty 10-02-22. Languages of foreign nations of Europe, Asia, Africa, aborigines of America and Australia, Arabic. On the theme Arabic rhymed prose in religious and ritual texts of pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabia, was accepted for defense by the academic secretary on the 20th of September 2020, 8528/1. Rozov, Vladimir Andreevich, wrote his thesis at St. Petersburg University under the guidance of Doctor of Sciences Professor of the Department of Arabic Philology of St. Petersburg University, Redkin Oleg Ivanovich. Number of publications that outline the key results of the thesis, according to the enclosed list, is 10. In peer-reviewed journals from the list approved by the Ministry of Science and Education of Russian Federation, 7 publications. In journals indexed in scientometric databases, Web of Science and Scopus, 1 publication. The degree applicant submitted to the academic secretary a full set of documents for acceptance of his thesis for consideration and defense. All the documents comply with Article 12 of Section 3 of the order. All the documents submitted by the applicant according to the information are received from the curator, comply with the requirements, and are kept in the applicant's attestation file. Copies are available from the Office of the Dissertation Council Activity Support Department, who is now present. Before I give the floor to the degree applicant, do you, dear council members, have any general questions to the applicant? And is it necessary to reveal and discuss the entire list of documents submitted by the applicant? No. No, that is not necessary. As I can see, no one has any general questions. Thus, let us give the floor, proceed to the next item, and let me give the floor for the summary report. Remember, you have 20 minutes. Vladimir Andreevich, the floor is yours. Thank you. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, dear council members. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Let me introduce to you a report on my thesis, Archaic Rhymed Prose in Religious and Ritual Texts of Pre-Islamic and Early Islamic Arabia. First of all, the thesis, I'd like to say the thesis covers archaic sajʿ and ritual texts of pre-Islamics and early Islamic times, since sajʿ is a kind of umbrella concept which includes archaic rhymed and rhythmical prose, which Dmitry Vladimirovich Frolov described as an early form of Arabic poetic speech, as well as later examples from the heyday of the Arab Muslim culture designed for the perception of a trained reader. In my thesis, I limited myself with archaic form of sajʿ, its functions at the dawn of Islam and the first decades thereafter. First, I'd like to say that sajʿ is a very interesting and understudied theme. Saj� was and still is in the shadow of traditional Arabic poetry composed using the Arabic verse system, arud. This lack of interest in saj� is characteristic of both medieval philologists and modern scholars. And there are a number of reasons for that. First is the relative simplicity and brevity of texts composed by means of the archaic form compared to poetic texts. Specific functions of saj�, which I will describe later, and the negative attitude towards saj�. among Islamic scholars, and the insufficiency of works determined the importance of the theme of my study. The main purpose of my work was to examine the functions of archaic sajʿ and the corresponding notions of it, among other phenomena which we can describe as sacred speech. So what is sacred speech exactly? In this paper, the concept following Iliad is understood broadly. It's everything that opposes the mundane, profane, special effective power. This is a socially conditioned category which makes it possible to speak of its linguistic expression. Thus, we may contrast profane, everyday communication and sacred communication, situation with the contact with the sacred. These may include ritual acts, communication with supernatural beings, and so on. And because of the interpenetration of these two categories, we may talk about the greater or lesser sacredness of these texts, communicative acts, and situations. This leads to interdisciplinary nature of my work lies on the between philology and theology. Thus, in combination with a set goal, determine the necessity for attracting extensive comparative material from ethnography relating to cultures of distant and chronologically from the object of my research, the archaic sajʿ at the turn of Islam. The analysis of this material showed us that sacred communication is characterized by a number of features that can be regarded as cultural features. Text at all levels, which the present is explained by the presence of rhythm, rhyme, and assonance, its special structure, and special forms of the language. These attributes seem to remove the text from the sphere of profane communication and give it special efficacy, turn it into the texts formulated by archaic saj� fully demonstrate all the above attributes, which allows us to consider them in the light of dichotomy between sacred and profane. The formal attributes of saj�, its classification, and the difference in approaches to the study of saj� by traditional Arab Muslim scholars was also touched upon in my thesis. The validity of the statement that saj� corresponds to the formal peculiarities of sacred speech clearly seen if we turn to Arabic sources describing the functions of saj� in the pre-Islamic society. The sources are used works of medieval scholars, different historians, philologists, biographers, and authors of religious works, such as Abu Jafar al-Tabari, Ibn Kathir al-Damashqi, Ibn Hisham al-Kalbi, Abu Bakr al-Jawiz, al-Askari, Ibn Hisham, etc. It's also important that much also used Quran and Hadith. Many fragments quoted Muslim have some traces of being false. We may still use these sources at the dawn of Islam. First, these texts are of interest to us not only from formal. Secondly, they're quoted in contexts that allow us to infer the views of medieval Muslim scholars on saj�. Moreover, we can observe polemic between these scholars on permissibility or impermissibility of saj�. And so these examples demonstrate that saj� is in Arabia is seen as sacred language, the language of revelation. It's medieval scholars who considered as kahin. It's important to note that kahins already were compared with shamans of Eurasia and America, but this comparison mainly concerned social functions and behavior. The similarity of linguistic means they used to express knowledge obtained during the and attributed to various kinds of supernatural beings that remain out of research side. Identification of linguistic similarities, then Kachin and shamanic texts formulated and explained in the thesis is an important step towards cognitive religious studies. Also, the use of sajʿ, famous telebir, addressing the deity when crossing the sacred space, has been recorded. This custom has been preserved in Islam, having transformed into one of the rituals. Thus, we may say that we have information confirming the use of sajʿ for communication with supernatural beings, both top-down, from beings to people, and bottom-up, from people to supernatural beings. Also, there is some information about the use of saj� in magic formulas and in other folklore texts related directly to sacred sphere. These data correlate with the still very much alive tradition to use rhymed and rhythmical prose in folklore texts and texts read in situations of contact with the sacred. There's also some structural similarity between texts recorded by medieval Muslim authors and modern folklore texts, including those obtained during expeditions to remote and archaic parts of the Arab world, including, for example, the work of Soviet-Yemen complex field trip. Many of the participants are now present at this session. And when recognized language of the sacred realm, saj� had a significant influence on the way in which new Islamic propositions were formulated in order to be perceived as revelation. New texts had to deal with, had to look what speech related to communication with supernatural should look like. In this light, we may consider the early surahs of Quran containing prophecies about the coming doomsday and protective prayers and carrying other ritual functions. The hadith material displays ambivalent attitude towards saj�. There are hadith in which saj� and its use in ritual contexts such as prayer and judgment is condemned. On the other hand, we know the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, including prayers formulated with saj� and his followers, was frequently used in speeches, khutbah, including such famous figures as Ali ibn Abi Talib, etc. This ambivalent attitude reflects the situation in which the early Islamic community found itself. On the one hand, striving to break from the past, and on the other, forced to use established and less understandable forms of communication within traditional society. Here, we may cite the gospel parable about young wine of monotheistic religion was poured into old vessels of Arabic forms, otherwise it would not be perceived properly by the first listeners of this revelation in historical and social contexts. And in conclusion, I'd like to proceed to propositions made for defense. First, in pre-Islamic Arabia, saj� fulfilled the function of sacred language, marking religious and ritual texts, despite a cautious attitude to rhymed and rhythmical prose recorded in the Islamic tradition. It continued to perform a sacred function after the victory of Islam, which is reflected in the early Islamic monuments. First of all, Quran and Hadith. Through Quran, the tradition of ritual speech formulated with the help of speech influenced ritual speech of peoples who practiced Islam but didn't speak Arabic. Secondly, the means of artistic expression characteristic of archaic saj� are inherent in ritual and religious texts of other world cultures. As such, saj� is in line with universal traditions of sacred speech. These features perform a number of functions, such as marking sacred text and separating it from profane and mundane conversation. Thanks to these features, the sacred text has greater persuasive power and shows signs of iconicity of extra-linguistic reality. The value and relevance of the work lies precisely in this comparison of sajʿ with other forms of sacred speech. An interesting but sort of byproduct of my research is the study of the formal features of saj�. They are well known, with unlike presence of rhyme and the essence of verse size. Both are mandatory in poetic text and absent in prose. But traditional terms, on the one hand, emphasize their role in creating textual unity, and on the other, their delimiting function. At the same time, the existing classification of saj� in the Arabic philological tradition, as well as its place in the system of speech forms, is determined by means of binary oppositions. This conclusion is extremely interesting from the point of view of semiotics, of meta-language, and may give impetus to new research in this field. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Vladimir Andreevich. Now we have the opportunity to ask Vladimir Andreevich questions. Questions should touch upon the thesis, the speech of the applicant, and do we have any questions for Vladimir Andreevich at this point? I don't see anyone willing to speak. Thus, we may proceed to the next item. On today's speeches are the Dissertation Council members with their reviews and assessment of the thesis, and with questions and suggestions to the degree applicant. The chairman shall present the external reviews, if any. The applicant may answer all the questions in the end, but I suggest the applicant answers questions after each council member speaks. Yes, that would be the best way to do it. Yes, I'm okay with that. Thank you. Okay. We received no external reviews as far as I know. Thus, let us proceed to speeches of the council members. And since all the reviews have been published at St. Petersburg University website, I suggest you focus on the key points and remarks to the applicant. Do you have any objections to this? I see there are no objections. Thank you, dear colleagues. Thus, first, I'd like to follow the order in which council members, in the alphabetic order. Following the alphabetic order, first, let me give the floor to Mikhail Sergeyevich Pelevin, Doctor of Philology, Professor, Head of Department of Iranian Philology of St. Petersburg University. Mikhail Sergeyevich, please. Let's turn the microphone on. Mikhail Sergeyevich, I beg your pardon. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you, that's very good. Then, dear chairman, dear colleagues, let me read the key points on which I would like to focus in this discussion. The thesis by Vladimir Andreevich Rozov would describe as a work in linguistic anthropology, a social which uses, approaches, and focus on social functions and other aspects of sajʿ of the early Middle Ages. Such speech is classified as universal phenomenon in world religious practice and culture. The main conclusion is that early Islamic period sajʿ in Arabic culture institutionally was sacred speech. Early cults and later in Islam. Vladimir Andreevich calls this language of sacred sphere used for communication with the supernatural, but also for all the special knowledge essential for the archaic society of profane type of discourse. The Arabic focus is on idea of inheritance of Quran and other later texts and their connection with the earlier traditions of magic in Islamic Arabia. The thesis is a result of systematic analysis of literature and including medieval manuscripts on poetry and other genres, quotes of religious works. In the thesis, and the author analyzes the features of sacred speech, discusses known approaches to sajʿ very concept, where the most important is the relation of various criteria, and discusses various aspects of early Arabic sajʿ. Of what is of interest is comparison, which demonstrates the continuity of the tradition and its connection. From the point of linguistics, it's interesting that the author mentions the taboos in similar to kahin and shaman speech. Unfortunately, this idea is barely, only very briefly touched upon. And comparing such, Vladimir Andreevich concludes that the style of revelations depends not only on chronology, but on the content, on the function played by this or that object. Page 103. But more attention is devoted to sajʿ in the early surah of the so-called poetic period. Here, I'd like to say that these are very short texts. Speaking of sajʿ in hadith, Vladimir Andreevich repeats many times his idea about the significance of mnemonic function of saj�, page 121. But I think this aspect could get more attention. One of the examples is on kinship. But as has been proved, such legal maxima coincide were published by Muslim lawyers in later periods, the end of 8th, early 9th century. The discussion of authenticity of pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arab texts, as excluding Quran, is in Vladimir Andreevich's work is hardly discussed at all, which is one of my main critical remarks. In any work should be based on clear understanding of the text. Though the author makes some reservation about authenticity of the studied text, page 47, 76, 82, etc. But in one case the author says, page 113, of course authenticity of this text causes certain doubts, yet as was demonstrated earlier, it is a legitimate source for the study of later images of what Kachin speech should look like. Such approach should be described in detail in the beginning of the study and make a give a brief history of various approaches. My second remark is connected with the first one, of the whole corpus of primary sources containing texts for the study of the theme and a list of key studies in this theme. I mean, the study of Arabic sajʿ. The tasks the author set himself, including the study of pragmatics of early Arabic texts and various elements, seems to be successfully completed, and use of various materials has clear structure, is interesting to read, and in general gives good understanding of the styles and functions and development of medieval Arabic sajʿ. Some observations on perception of sacred world of the Arabs, and the approach enable us to conclude on the author's contribution to the study of medieval Arabic literature in a wider cultural context. In conclusion, the thesis by Vladimir Rozov on cake saj� rhymed and corresponds to the key requirements set by the legal acts, and the degree applicant Vladimir Rozov deserves awarding the degree of candidate of philology, specialty 100222, languages of foreign peoples. Dear colleagues, thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Mikhail Sergeyevich. Now, let me give the floor to Vladimir Andreevich and let him answer critical remarks made by the council member. Thank you for such a wide review, and let me start with the fundamental question, both a question about authenticity of sources and their use for exploration of our theme. First of all, the question of credibility to Arabic sources and to how they communicate the pre-Islamic text to us is not new. This question was asked by Margolis, Taha Hussein in Arabic Times. Patricia Crone criticized the medieval Arabic sources. But it should be said that such criticism is based on position of maximum lack of trust to everything the Arab scholars say. Very often this criticism is explained by political considerations. For example, Taha Hussein, famous Egyptian researcher who did not trust pre-Islamic Arab poetry, was the ideology, deification of tradition. But I'd like to, the late fixation of text is not in itself an argument in favor of forgery, since in such a case we also have to deny authenticity of many other sources. As for specific examples, these can be divided into two large groups. Some, indeed, there are some sources, the authenticity of which we doubt, and where forged nature has been proved. So this includes all kind of prophets, divinations, and those soothsayers made those prophecies So these are different types of Kachin texts which also bear in traces of forgery, and on the other hand we have a group of texts the authenticity of which we maybe cannot doubt. There are no real reasons. They don't touch upon sensitive issues such as weather, all kinds of folklore texts, etc. Why I think that these both sources can be used as material for the analysis of sajʿ, and why I have used them. As for the folklore sources, there is no clear evidence of forgery. They make important part of tribal identity. In the at the time, in early Islamic period, the constantly tribal identity. We have no reasons to doubt that folklore in the good. As for Kachin texts, many of them, as hopefully I have demonstrated in my work, they demonstrate early pre-Islamic traditions, and if we compare with later folkloric sources, which to me seems to be a serious argument, and if we compare them with already available with sources created in Islam during the Islamic period. But what I would like to say here is that the work is of typological nature. I have considered the function of sajʿ among other phenomena that we can describe as sacred speech, and because of that I think it is possible to use even those sources which of course I would describe as unreliable if my work was of historical nature, or if I was exploring genesis of rhymed prose. As for the other comments, I agree that of course some points should be discussed in more detail, namely the point about the mnemonic function of saj�, because it seems to me very interesting and deserves more attention. And of course in the future I found a lot of interesting material on this. As for small amount of Quran text used in my study, Quran is not exactly is a continuum of texts which went in the course of its composition some stylistic changes and some evolution. And the early examples of Quran can be seen as reflecting the tradition of pre-Islamic sacred thought, because the public were still not prepared to perceive the prophet, as a head, a future head of the theocratic state and religious community. So it was necessary to use the forms of speech that were familiar and understandable, but put new meaning into them. So this goes without saying. The content is new. As for the replacement function, thank you for this comment. Out of examples, from the number of examples I can give, is a story of the description of a military assault which says they did not destroy dry walls and wet trees. So these words related to very important elements of the society of life can be traced in Musaylima texts, which I have quoted in my thesis, but I have to say that when we talk about replacement vocabulary, this material deserves a separate study. That would be a very interesting topic and could be study. It would be better to study on use poetry, because it would, but in the study in this sphere by Betty Schitfer, Anna Dalinina, so I think that these are familiar things, and that including them in a wider anthropological context would deserves a separate work. Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir Andreevich. Mikhail Sergeyevich, are you satisfied with the applicant's answers? Yes, I am. Thank you. Thank you. Then let me proceed and give the floor to Yefim Anatolovich Rezvan, Doctor of History, Professor, Head of Research Direction of Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography of Russian. Good afternoon, dear friends. Recently, my student working on Quran for many years, her colleague approached her and asked her, what do you think? What are you studying? Everything has been written about Quran and everything has been studied. And in my opinion, everything, all your effort is useless. So that's a very common opinion. And if we take all literature dedicated to Quran, we would end up with a huge library. And it seems that all the issues have been addressed. But if we look at the sphere of the modern discussion, there are discussions of the most basic concepts of Quran, the place where it was written, the time it was written. And there are serious arguments, for example, that Quran was written in the 9th, not in Arabia, but much further north. There is we may see a serious discussion, and our opponents would immediately catch us out. And in this respect, any work dedicated to the forms of Quran and its language, and in my opinion, the only serious source that can answer questions about the origin of Quran, its history, the form of Quran and its language. So any new work which attempts to explore this sphere is of great interest, in my opinion, and because of that, I highly welcome the work of our applicant. Let me say that I followed his research for a number of years, And moreover, I hope that very much that if all goes well, we will together in the future work in one of we'll have a joint project, because in my opinion, what's a thesis? Let's think of the basic things. A thesis is like an entry pass into the scientific world, which proves that someone has adequate competence to continue his work. It was, as was the case with medieval guilds, it was necessary to create a masterpiece and to prove to the master that you may also be a master. And because of that, it seems to me that our applicant deserves his seal, this right to be a researcher. This is the basic purpose of the thesis, to prove that the applicant can professionally and on a high level conduct research in the future, to join the community of researchers has been achieved. And as a potential employer, I'm taking this very seriously. That does not mean that I don't have any critical remarks. I have them certainly, and I shall list them in a minute. But from the beginning, in my opinion, they don't have have a major role. Is the question of authenticity of examples of archaic sajʿ that are available. The author tried to solve this challenging problem by using material from other cultures, by using the semiotic approach to the study of formal functional features of religious ritual texts, by using works of senior colleagues, the analysis of social function in Arabic culture based on contemporary materials, and the works of Mikhail Anatolievich. Maybe this thesis would not be written, so he was lucky that to live and work in such a place. Such an approach is certainly interesting, though goes outside the scope of traditional critique, following the terminology proposed on page 13. The situation could be compared to police terminology, where see fingertips. If we had a manuscript written in sajʿ, and if we were sure the author is Musallaya, so then we would be no problem. So that manuscript would be our fingerprint. And if when there are no fingerprints, so oblique evidence collected by the author prove that sajʿ in pre-Islam Arabia has formal and functional features characteristic of verbal sacred text in many cultures, and thus is a universal phenomenon. And this gives us the reasons to believe that the goals set by the author have been achieved. The list of literature and sources consists of 144 works, and to my deepest regret, it includes excellent books, and is very good that the author has mastered so much literature, but four key, in my opinion, monographs are missing, published not so long ago in English, though even though we actually discussed, I believe the author saw this book and knows this book and maybe has read this book, so I don't know why he never included it. Maybe that's a technical thing. But anyways, these works sum up the research of the late 20th century of Quran and the approach that they have recorded, analyzing Quran in connection with its environment. I recommend the author to study carefully the materials published by Dr. Grezhnevich, who studied the picture of the world and language using the same theoretical approaches as Kasevich, relies on Arabic material mostly, and I think the achievements of the colleague would make the author's discourse more convincing, though I don't think that it would radically change anything in the thesis. In the end of his thesis, the author mentions that a number of important, interesting themes remain outside the scope of this thesis. They could become themes of separate research, including perception of Arabic language as sacred means of communication in Muslim cultures and detailed analysis of sajʿ evolution from its archaic forms to literary examples. I would certainly include material of Arabic archaeology and epigraphics, which are more available to experts today, to researchers today, and provide serious and independent research basis. I hope that together with the author we will work on these materials in the future as well. I believe this material would help to create a better evidence base of the surviving fragments with early archaic examples. The work of Rozov is written in good academic language and is practically free of stylistic and spelling mistakes. This is an independent study which manifests the author has mastered tools connected with the scientific provisions and conclusions, well grounded, been tested at Russian international conferences in highly rated journals. The study demonstrates good knowledge of the author, and generally speaking, the thesis by Vladimir Andreevich Rozov, sajģ rhymed prose in religious and ritual texts of pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabia, corresponds to the requirements set by the order on the 1st of September 2016, number 6821/1, on awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. And the degree applicant, Vladimir Andreevich Rozov, deserves awarding the degree of Candidate of Philology, Specialty 100222, Languages of Foreign Peoples of Europe, Asia, Africa, Aborigines of America and Australia, Arabic. Article 11 of the above-mentioned order has not been violated by the author. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Yefim Anatolievich. Now, let me give the floor to Vladimir Andreevich Rozov and let him answer comments. Vladimir Andreevich, please remember, we have 20 minutes. You have 20 minutes to answer all the questions. So please make your answers shorter. Please remember your time limit. First of all, once again, I'd like to start from the end and the mention of epigraphics. Of course, excluding epigraphics from my thesis, but what it will give us some votive. It will not provide us with the most interesting, which is the main. It will not provide us information about texts produced during ecstatic states, but texts even recorded secondhand with some mistakes and mention in what states these texts were generated can provide us with some knowledge about texts and compare Hachin and shamanistic texts, which for me personally was the most interesting point. Speaking of collection of works, of course this is an omission, a serious drawback, but all these collections mostly devoted to Quran. Of course they the context is also, but let's take one, Quran in context, in index. When you take up soothsayer, Hachin, we find only one in this entire collection in Jan Red's article, Arabs and Arabic in the Age of the Prophet, where he quoting well-known information written earlier by Zvetler and Dr. Petrovsky and many other researchers, and of course Angelika Novit provides excellent comparison, but I think this would only confirm my conclusions. What upset me is the work of sajʿ on Talbiyah missed, because it contains many Talbiyah texts and a lot in its content, but some texts considered free of suspicion because the author applied very strict criteria that would increase my evidence base. But despite all that, I certainly agree that it was a serious drawback of mine. Thank you for. So I'm fully satisfied with the answer. Thank you, Vladimir Andreevich, Yefim Anatolievich. Now we may, since Yefim Anatolievich is satisfied, we may give the floor to the next member. Let us give the floor to Mikhail Anatolovich Rodionov, Doctor of History, Professor, Senior Researcher of the Department of Southeast Asia of Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography of Russian Academy of Sciences, St. Petersburg. Mikhail Anatolovich, the floor is yours. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Thank you. A lot has been said already, so I will just touch upon some points. First of all, I'd like to say that the theme is maybe because it considers functions of rhyme and rhyme in sacred practices before and during the early years of Islam, and the author managed to solve this task very well because he considered the functional features of Islam, of sajʿ, and here the discussion, is the material authentic or not authentic, is not that important. Here we're talking about functions and structure and methods of use, and in relation with this, the practice demonstrates that these are very important and very sustainable, very stable in every culture. When today a poet starts reading poetry in the South Arabia, immediately locals would say, no, he's not a real poet, he cannot memorize a word of his poetry. Stephen Caton gave in where he remembered how at inauguration of the President of the United States, a poet dropped a piece of paper and found himself in a difficult situation. He could not continue. And so the demons of poetry, they are very important today for the people of Arabia, and sajʿ is not poetry, that's prose. But the difference between the most primitive examples of poetry and sajʿ is minimal. Both discuss that people started writing this like this because of camels. A camel doesn't hear the rhyme but can feel the rhythm, and a messenger of is don't pray in front of a camel, because the devil is hiding behind the camel. And in relation with this, we may remember in the 19th century, in a conflict, used a slogan which included the 4 elements formula of the federation of epigraphics. And I am not saying that this formula has never changed, but what I'm saying, the situation is very similar and produces, that is why I say similar linguistic products are produced. And because of that, I can say that the most interesting is a great number of documents where formulas are used and connected with relations regulation. So the rhymed terms, and the author, the applicant himself, called them binary positions. And here I see a lot of potential for future work. So here even a wider approach can be used as intersection of the two worlds. In the traditional picture of the world, of the people and demons that surround the world of people. And so this picture is a same element of superstition to lots of people, that it seems to be a real world. And also, in conclusion, I'd like to say that the traditional part, that the work of corresponds to all the requirements and deserves that the author is awarded the desired degree. At that, I will finish my speech. Mikhail Anatolovich, thank you very much. Now let us give the floor to Vladimir Andreevich. Let him answer questions and comments. Thank you for high assessment of my work, and indeed I considered this work as an initial stage of major research, comparative study of different forms of sacred speech, first of all in Arabic cultural zone. And as for the special attention to communication with the supernatural, it seems to me that this is the nucleus of my work, the Hahin speech, and comparing it with the shamanistic speech. So this is how my thesis started. Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir Andreevich. Mikhail Anatolovich, are you satisfied with the answer? Yes, I am, certainly. Thank you. Okay, in that case, let us give the floor to the next member of the Dissertation Council to let us give the floor to Professor Jaakko Markus Hämeen Anttila, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of Edinburgh University. You have the floor, Professor Hämeen Anttila.
Thank you. First of all, let me apologize for lacking Russian, the knowledge of Russian, so I have to speak English, unfortunately. The thesis of the candidate is, of course, or the topic of the candidate's thesis is very important and very interesting. Sajә is very relevant when we speak about any kind of early Islamic or early Arabic literature. It has its importance for understanding the genesis of poetry, perhaps. It's related to the Quran very intimately, as we know, and of course it has its role also in later later Arabic prose. However, the topic is of course also a very difficult one, and many would fear to tread the area of pre-Islamic history and religion because of the many problems that are involved in the question. The main issues, of course, are in this kind of a study are source critical. How do we consider these sources and their authenticity? I think that there is no doubt about the general existence of Sajә in pre-Islamic and early Islamic times. That cannot be doubted, but the more we go into details, the more problematic our study will become. Now, the candidate has discussed Sajә from several different points, and I would like to raise a couple of issues that I would like to ask the candidate about. But before doing that, I may perhaps join in the opinion of my esteemed colleagues who are much better acquainted with the expectations at the University of St. Petersburg, and I already now would like to express that I conclude that the candidate may be considered to deserve awarding the degree of candidate of philology as he desires. Now, there are some issues I'd like to raise and some questions I'd like to pose to the candidate. Due to the limitations of time, I will only point a couple of ones, and I'm looking forward to their answers. Partly, of course, these have already been covered by my esteemed colleagues in the panel. I would perhaps ask three questions. The first considers the use of Islamic sources for pre-Islamic life, religion, and society. So my basic question to the candidate is, does he consider that Islamic texts are accurate and reliable sources for understanding pre-Islamic life, religions, and society? So the question is more, what is wider than just just about sajʿ, but also about the descriptions of the kahins in Islamic texts, etc. So, to what extent can we rely on these, on the accuracy of these texts and the descriptions? My second question considers what the candidate says on pages 15, 16 of the English translation, unfortunately, where he lists his main arguments and mentions that sajʿ is separated, and I quote, from profane, sharply separated from profane quotidian speech, acts, and utterances. Now, if I would say that sajʿ was used much wider than only for sacred speech, that we know it from lullabies and riddles, we know it from animal fables and etiologies, we know it from weather reports and all various kinds of descriptions. We find sajʿ in all of these fields. So, what would the candidate say about the sharp distinction between of sajʿ as a sacred speech, because it is also used elsewhere? That is at least how I would see that. And then finally we come to the third and last question, considering the source critical issues of especially the sajʿ passages. It is actually a double question. On the other hand, we do know that in early Islam, at the beginning of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad was suspected by his opponents accused by his opponents of being a kahin, and that of course relates at least partly to the fact that the contemporaries saw some similarity between kahin style and the early Quranic style. So, what is the danger that the kahin sentences we actually have today are basically created on the basis of the Quranic early surahs, not the other way around? And related to this, what is the candidate's? How does the candidate comment on the possibility of many of the sentences, kahin sentences, especially those attributed to Musaylima and the other so-called pseudo-prophets, that the sentences attributed to them should be seen as travesties of the Quran, and in some cases at least, they could be suspected of being ridiculous on purpose, so that they have been created to show that, for example, Musaylima was a pseudo-prophet and his text was so far from the genuine revelation in the Quran, in which case, of course, the such sentences would be a travesty and not very authentic. So these questions I'm looking forward to hearing an answer, I'm looking forward to hear the answer and see how the candidate replies to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hammond and Antila, for your commentary.
Let me give the floor to answer comments and critical remarks. Thank you. Thank you for your questions and for your review, of which I have very high opinion. Let me start with the second question. You mentioned prophecies, folkloric texts, lullabies, magic fairy tales, etc. The folkloric texts used where sajʿ was used. But so here I can argue that all these texts belong to the sacred sphere, because the world of childhood, the world of transition from non-existence to the world full of dangers, full of fears, this is nothing else but the ritual of transition, and the texts read to children. These texts are related to the sacred world. Of course, This is not the most archetypal, crystallized, pure example of sacred speech, but I think we may consider them as sacred, as Taylor has done in his time, who devoted a whole chapter of his work to sacred phenomena in profane culture, and he has included many items from the world of childhood in this realm. So that's all I wanted to say about the world. As for weather forecasts, well, today weather forecast is done by satellite. At the time weather forecasts were made, was a prophecy which affected the lives of people directly, immediately. I mean, literally, the world, life or death. It was a life or death question. Such texts would be classified as sacred texts. And I'm working on our book, which contains many detailed texts, and I can say that they contain not only fragments about the weather, but also some sentences that could be relate to astrology, and hopefully I have answered your second question. As for the use of Islamic sources, for the study of pre-Islamic period, unfortunately we don't have any other reliable sources. Epigraphics is a very interesting thing, but unfortunately it can provide information only but limited spheres of life and contexts, and it's dead. It has no voice of its own. As for the sources from parallel cultures, Persian, Byzantine, then why Islamic sources we deny, and sources from other peoples we trust. I think this approach is wrong. Even ancient Greeks mention widespread of prophecy practices among the Arab peoples. And as for technical use of medieval Arabic and Muslim sources for description of pre-Islamic times, of course, we need to be aware of the critical attitude of the authors to this time, the pre-Islamic times. But also, I believe some every details of everyday life and context of use can provide very vivid impression, give very vivid impressions. Not to say that in Islamic pre-Islamic poetry, we know from Islamic sources, and we trust the hadith. So I think it's legitimate to use Islamic sources for the study of pre-Islamic times. Being aware of the author's positions and being aware that some negative or different types of jokes or maybe criticism of old time, but the overall picture of life they can provide. And also, as you know, many authors, especially true of lexicographers, ethnographers, of course they were not called. They visited the Bedouin tribes, they studied practices which are still found in most archaic societies. So I believe we can use the medieval Arabic sources without being hypercritical. But of course, we should not trust them. We should not be blind in our faith. And as I mentioned already, a fake banknote is still a banknote. As for the issue you touch upon in your question 3 about the texts, Musalima's text, of course I agree that later mimicking travesties assigned to false prophets, they may of course be compiled, maybe forged as an example on the basis of Quran to criticize stupidity, short-sightedness of those prophets, soothsayers. But that immediately starts a number of questions, raises a number of questions. Who has done that? What's the evidence of that forgery? And when something is forged as Hakhin texts, early speeches, khutbah, which in Arab and Muslim sources, they all originate from the same period of pre-Islamic language. Musalima's forgery, forged in the Middle Ages by Arabic scholars, but we also have other texts, folkloric texts, which structurally and functionally fit in this picture. So I agree that examples attributed to Sulaiman are certainly forged, though there are interesting, they contain interesting things, such as the use of words with the same roots. Arabic philologists in the Middle Ages were quite expert on this, but we may see these texts as illustrations of medieval philologists of what sajʿ should look like, and these images seem to be very valuable to me. Thank you, Vladimir Andreevich. Professor Haminen Antila, are you satisfied with the applicant's answers?
Oh, hi.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Since a council member is satisfied, let me proceed to the next point and read my review as the chairman of the Dissertation Council. As was mentioned already, I will make the descriptive part of my review very short, and I shall not present critical remarks regarding style, and will focus only on the important issues that I consider important. So the work of Vladimir Andreevich Rozov consists of 4 chapters: introduction and conclusion. The first chapter is dedicated to language functioning in the sphere of sacred, illustrated of different cultures. The second chapter describes formal characteristics of sajʿ and its varieties. Third chapter analyzes functioning of archaic saj� as the language of sacred sphere in pre-Islamic Aramaic, and the fourth chapter analyzes its evolution in the Islamic period, including analysis of saj� elements in Quran and Hadith. The bibliography concludes 144 works. The author demonstrates perfect knowledge with literature. The subject of the thesis, rhymed prose saj�, seems very interesting and complex phenomenon. Its adequate description requires complex approach, which the author successfully demonstrates. As was mentioned today, the interdisciplinary nature of the study fully reflects the complex nature of saj�, which lies at the junction of 3: language of semiotics, literature and poetry, ethnography and religion. And here I listed practically most of humanities in the realm of anthropology, and the author manages to cope with complexity during his entire study, demonstrate knowledge in different spheres of life, and trace their relation to the process of historic changes. Though it should be noted that this strong or inevitable advantage of the thesis, its complexity, has a reverse side. So for a linguist, maybe it focuses too much on history of religion, and for theologists, it's too little linguistics. But maybe that's inevitable than describing such a complex phenomenon. Also, it's necessary to give some specific comments, stylistic comments I will drop. Page 16, a sacred text has great convincing power, demonstrates iconic of non-language reality. For me, this fragment requires clarification. What is demonstrated by sacred text? Iconicity. Page 20, the early stages of development of human culture. For me, a term of culture, then term of development, but I believe the development of the society. There's no such thing as development of culture. Of society. Next, page 38. In other words, semantic pseudo words of ecstatic word. I'm quoting of ecstatic speech. You have one common feature. They do not convey the logical information. They are one of the codes of nonverbal communication. Here, of course, there is reference to work. So here the author quoted, this is not the author's opinion, but in my opinion, word, even as a quote, how words and speech can be non-verbal requires some clarification, which is missing here. Non-verbal means not of words and language. Page 40. In connection with that, it's possible to talk about social and psychobiological function of rhyme and reason. So here, the question is it social or psychobiological? These are antonyms which cannot be listed with a comma. They are opposites. Page 42, in Western languages. Here again, there is reference to a famous researcher of ideophones. That's his expression, Western languages. But since, in this case, either we support this opinion, but I do not divide languages into Western and Eastern and Southern. In linguistics we have different. I know that sometimes the term Western languages, and I know why, but in scientific research, in scientific discussion, I think it requires more clarification of more critical nature. They follow in the relation of sajʿ and poetry, sound symbolism, iconicity, alliteration, and assonance. On page 59, sajʿ is characterized as prose with elements of rhythm and rhyme, but early on page 50, saj�, here I'm quoting, is characteristic of rhyme, but no meter. Rhyme and meter are different. There's no explanation, and then this contradiction. In principle, the difference between saj� and prose is demonstrated. The difference between saj�, between saj� and poetry. Maybe they are more subtle, and in that context, the phrase on page 102, what is characteristic of Quran, as parts contain rhyme and rhythm, but at that they are quite far from pre-Islamic tradition of sacred speech, which are early examples of Arabic prose. But if there is rhythm and rhyme, why is it prose? Why do we call it prose? Page 107. Characteristic feature of early surah is a wide use of sound symbolism, which is achieved of use of ideophones. Here I quoted, ideophones of course have to do with sound symbolism, but in the case of alliteration, this is less obvious and requires clarification. The same problem we come across on page 134. At that, alliteration assonance in sacred texts depict phenomena of external world and a source of iconicity between sign, symbol, and the world. The link between alliteration, assonance, and iconicity require clarification. is, I should mention, number of repetitions. Sometimes they are grounded, but this is about style. So let me proceed to the conclusion. In conclusion, let me say some words about the system of references. Maybe the author used some rules, followed some rules consistently, perfectly within this system. So my questions are maybe apply to this system, not to the author, because the location in the end of the page interferes with perception of the text, and in my opinion, the footnotes on each page, there are 340 footnotes, but when reading the text and having to look it up each time interferes with perception of the text, and maybe the list of references would be much more reader friendly, and maybe the author should think more about using this system. All the above mentioned remarks are not of principal nature and do not put any doubt on the value of Vladimirov's Rozov thesis, description of complex and interesting phenomena. At least in my opinion, the thesis reads well and helps to get good impression of the phenomenon. And the formal phrase, the thesis by Rozov Vladimir Andreevich on the theme archaic sajʿ, rhymed and prose in religious and ritual texts of pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabic, corresponds to the basic requirements set on the 1st of September 2016 on the order of awarding academic degrees in St. Petersburg State University. And the degree applicant Rozov Vladimir Andreevich deserves awarding the degree of candidate of philology, specialty 10-22-2020, languages of foreign peoples of Europe, Asia, Africa, aborigines of America and Australia, Arabic. Article 11 of the above-mentioned order has not been violated by the author. Thank you for your attention, and now let me give the floor to Vladimir Andreevich Rozov. Thank you. As for the system of references, I absolutely agree, but unfortunately I had to follow the standard. As for your comment regarding page 716, how exactly the text, how a text can be iconic. Of course, a symbol can be iconic, but a text is a system of symbols, and of course the properties of a system depend on the properties of its components, and that is why we may talk about iconicity on separate levels of text organization and structure. Let me give you a simple example. Ritual. We have certain rituals which mark entering the ritual, the nucleus of the ritual, where the action is performed, which is the heart of the ritual. And there are some actions that mark our exit from the ritual into profane world. Once we have completed everything, the sacred text often has the same structure. We have some formula, initiation that takes us in the realm of sacred text. We have sacred text organized in a particular way, and I think this is one of the features of iconicity. Just like the world around us goes in circles, and in the same manner, the text that has to influence this world also goes in circles, is well structured and opposed to chaos, and exit from the sacred text, the end of it, though of course the initiation is almost a must, but some exit markers we come across seldom. As for your comment regarding page 38, pseudo words, they do not communicate verbal information as such. They serve as background for rhythmical movements. And though, of course, this sound is made by humans, it can be seen as verbal, but to great degree it plays the same role as music or singing or beating a drum. So that's why it can be described as non-verbal communication and such speech behavior, because speaking in supernatural languages, speaking in pseudo languages, this is a separate theme that cannot be assessed as described as non-verbal. As for page 40, social and psychobiological is a misprint. I think that both these aspects are important, social and psychobiological, and if necessary I can give you a detailed answer to this question. As for page 42, in the text itself it says why the English language and European languages. I agree that languages, they're not divided into Western, Eastern, Northern and Southern languages, though cultures of the cultures of native speakers certainly belong to them. If we standard average European, maybe that would sound better, and maybe I should have used this term. Say that standard average European languages, maybe ideophones are uncommon. As for page 59, the meter, here we have to talk about the Arab poetry system. Alternation of long and short stops, limited set of combinations, this traditional system of quantitative poetry called arud. This organized speech in the Arab culture, seen as poetic in true sense of the word, it's called poetry in the true sense of the word, or the word. If we look at this scheme in the table on the right, contains both rhyme and meter. As for sajʿ, it lacks such quantitative meter, but it certainly contains rhythmic organization, and this rhythmic organization is based on equal length of lines. So we're talking about lexical stress, and the same organization, same rhythm, is based on the repetition of similar morphological patterns, words created according to the same morphological model, which is typical of the Arabic languages. As for Quran, under the influence of the tradition, I'm talking about rhyme, the end words of ayats, but the problem is ayats can be very long, like one paragraph long by our standards. And so when the two sentences, paragraph long sentences are rhymed, talking about rhyme in pure poetic sense doesn't make sense at all. So we're talking about prose. So late surahs of Quran, from the point of our classification, our standards, is usually described as prose. And examples of Arabic prose, as was demonstrated by researchers, Frolov, already mentioned here. As for ideophones are words that depict or show various phenomena of the world. Alliteration creates some sound symbolic effect in a broad sense, in the literary sense, and if we substitute these words for if I substitute for phonetic organization, there'll be no such question, and it's not necessary for the text organized with the help of alliteration to name any phenomena, to translate certain feelings. Let me give you two examples from Russian poetry. And the stray ruffling his hair, confusing the meaning, he'll dazzle you with his silly fairy tale, with his silly tale about me, by Pasternak. Here we have this sealing or whispering, but the word whispering is not used in this paragraph, in this verse. So this creates the effect. And in this sense, the last surah of Quran is interesting, one of the last, Anas, which contains idophones, vasvasa, which means to whisper, and alliteration in the text creates this effect. There is ideophone, and the text organization alliteration creates this effect. So maybe I should not have called it sound symbolic. Maybe this effect should not be called sound symbolic, because in linguistics this term has its own meaning, but I used it in a broad meaning. As for iconicity and ideophones, alliterations, as I have explained, they create phonetic organization, sound symbolism in a broad sense. As for iconicity, relation between symbol, sign, and its object, this happens not only on the lexical level, on the phonetic level, but on other levels as well, on syntactic, morphological. I can give you an example. Second, if we talk about linguistics, syntaxis, text structure. So here we may talk about the use of alliteration of ideophones as a specific case of iconicity, which is typical for sacred texts. That's all. Thank you. In my turn, I can say that I'm satisfied with the answer, maybe except the sentence that text is a system of symbols, because language is a system of symbols. Now let us proceed to the next phase of our session, and I have to ask if anyone present is willing to speak. And or in online mode we have, as you may see, two guests, and I can see one that Mikhail Borisovich Petrovsky put his hand up. Let me introduce Mikhail Barisavich Petrovsky, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Academician of Russian Academy of Sciences, Professor, Dean of the Faculty of Oriental Studies in Petersburg University, Director of State Hermitage Museum. Mikhail Barisovich, welcome. Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Thank you. We have a very brave the author here touched two very serious issues: Hakhin speech and Quran. And Hakhin speech has been forged many times, and he managed to touch upon these serious issues, very sensitive issues, in a very subtle, very delicate manner. So we have the very convincing picture, which is a big step forward in working with secondary texts such as historical literature. This is often built upon the fiction principles, which the author uses. We have In Arabic studies, we have many examples of fluctuation. Yes, no, yes, no. Islamic Arab poetry, all late, forged, and as is epic, which can be used, still be used if you know how to use it. And we may see that the author is displayed great mastery. Maybe he could explain me later how he has done that. But so that needs some clarification. The second important point is that the author introduced into our practice of Arabic Oriental studies the whole generation of researchers, many of whom are present. They created a system of knowledge and opinion which is open to development. So this development is done by the next generation, which includes many researchers, including the degree applicant. And I think that is a very important and interesting point. And so here it's important that the author, he didn't want to, maybe he wanted to, he didn't want to argue. He should have talked more about books mentioned by Yefim Anatolovich in his review to discuss the so maybe that we could expect him to do this in the future. In general, I think the thesis is a success. It is relevant, it is convincing, it's interesting, it's academic, and it proves that the author deserves awarding the degree, and I recommend the council members vote for awarding the degree. Thank you very much, Mikhail Barisavich. And I see we have another guest who's willing to speak. Alexander Andreevich Knish, professor of Islamic Studies, Department of Michigan, Oriental South Michigan University. Alexander Dmitrievich, the floor is yours. I will make it short because we don't have so much time left. I agree with the opinion of most, as I think, council members, that the thesis deserves, the author deserves the degree, and I'm glad that this work is a success, has been a success. The question of origin, sajʿ, and collecting it is very important. Almost all the colleagues touched upon this, all the other speakers. What I would like to say is that the academic community has fallen into two groups. Some researchers see whole shops full of forgers who produced fake lyrics, fake rhymes, fake poetry. So that's one extremity, which includes some Western researchers, including Patricia Crone, Michael Cook, who in the end abandoned their radical opinions. They made themselves famous. Plagiarism, the making of the Muslim word, and then they abandoned. They adopted more moderate position. So it was a kind of a trick. As for Western researchers, Angelika Neuwirth and Nikolai Sinai, I looked up their works and I can quote. Maybe I will not do it now. They have repeated, confirmed what the same conclusions to which the author has arrived, as the author has said. Their wordings are very similar, nothing really innovative. That is why I think that at the same time, I think the author should devote more attention to, as Mikhail Barisavich has said, and as others have said, to insist on his description of his own opinion, which is in this sphere has divided into several groups, and so maybe very convincing. That is why the author will find his voice, but I think he has already taken the first step in his scientific career, and the only thing he has to do now is to find his own voice, his own niche, or maybe change his field of research. But I think this important step in his academic career he has completed successfully. Thank you, Alexander Dmitrievich. And that, as I can see, the discussion, this is the end of our discussion, because I don't see anyone else willing to speak. So we have to proceed to the next, the reading of questions sent online. But as far as I know, as I have been informed, we received no questions online. Oleg Ivanovich is next item. I was going to give the floor to him. Oleg Ivanovich, or you want to ask a question? No, because the next point is the speech shall be speech of the academic advisor. Oleg Ivanovich, now so now the floor is yours. Please tell us about the degree applicant and his work. Thank you. Dear Chairman, dear Council members, as my review has been published at St. Petersburg University, so I will just add something. As was mentioned earlier, the work has interdisciplinary nature, and it's a very advanced field of research. The author used tools of linguistic research and literary analysis and Islamic studies, and the complexity of the problem he touches upon explains the methodology, and because of that it goes beyond the scope of tasks of the study. The number of questions which, as the author has not touched upon, including the question of authenticity of sources to make the final decision on that, along with conventional methods, it's necessary to use other instruments such as mathematical analysis, which we have not. For the problem analyzed by the author is very relevant, and conclusions can be used in teaching Quran and history of Arabic literature, can become a starting point for future research in the field of Quran studies and linguistics and other fields. The author is an inquisitive mind who constantly improves. He developed his own scientific style, academic style of presenting his thoughts. He used the methods of St. Petersburg University and outside. Also, I'd like to say that the author took part in implementation of scientific project methodology of Quran and the guidance of Dr. Kasevich, the Oriental text, which enabled him, in my opinion, to write his thesis. The purposes, the goals of which he has accomplished, and I think the degree applicant deserves awarding the degree. Thank you very much, Oleg Ivanovich. Now, following the procedure, I would like to ask my colleagues, is anyone willing to speak once again about today's work? May I? Just a couple of words, Mikhail Sergeyevich. I would just like to say a word. in favor of epigraphics because 2 times Vladimir Andreevich said that epigraphics is in the critical manner, he called it dead. So I'd like to remind you that epigraphics is in the basis of the study of most ancient languages, history of Asia and Africa. So maybe it's necessary to recommend to the author to be more careful when speaking about various issues. Thank you, Mikhail Sergeyevich, for this word. Yes, I think we may agree that sometimes it's necessary to be more subtle, and not only regarding epigraphics. Now, if I see no one else is willing to speak, to take part in our discussion, since our session is conducted with some participants working the remote access mode, do council members or others present, or maybe the degree applicant, have any unanswered questions connected with our working mode? If yes, please let me know. No. I see no questions. Then let us proceed. Dear colleagues, now we have the opportunity, before we vote, to take a break to discuss the results of defense, and the sound shall be switched off. What do you think? Do we need any time to discuss the results? Do we need such a break? Or we are ready to vote? Yeah, we are ready to vote. We are ready. Everybody's ready to vote. I see everybody's ready to vote. Then, if we don't need any private discussion, let us continue without such a break, and let us proceed to voting. At that, each council member has to give his opinion in public and independently. Thus, once again, before we vote, let's make sure we can all the systems are working properly. Can we all see and hear each other? Dear colleagues working in the remote access, please say once again that you can hear you, you can see yeah. Mikhail Sergeyevich, yes, yes, I can see and hear you. Mikhail Anatolyevich, yes, you can hear me, yes. Professor Haminenantila, yes.
Sure, I can hear and see.
Спасибо большое.
Very well, thank you. Thus, I put a question of awarding to Vladimir Andreevich Rozov a degree of candidate of philology, specialty 100222, languages of foreign nations of Europe, Asia, Africa, aborigines of America, Australia, Arabic, to open individual vote. Let me remind you that the decision of the Dissertation Council on awarding a degree shall be considered positive if at least, if more than a half, but at least 3 members of the Dissertation Council voted for it, according to Article 23 of the Order. Thus, Council Member Pelevin Mikhail Sergeyevich, your opinion, please. I am for awarding the degree. Thank you very much. Council Member Rezvan Yefim Anatolovich, I am for awarding the degree. Thank you. And we can hear you very well. Council Member Rodionov Mikhail Anatolovich, your opinion, please. I am for awarding the degree. Thank you. We heard you. Council Member Yakov Marcus Hamin Antila, your opinion, please.
I'm in favor of awarding the degree.
Я за присуждение.
Спасибо. Ваше мнение так.
Thank you. You see. And me as a chairman, Zoltov Alexander Yurovich, for awarding the degree. I think Vladimir Andreevich deserves being awarded the degree of Candidate of Sciences. Thus, now I can count the votes and inform you of the results. Dear colleagues and guests, let me inform you that out of council members participating in the voting, 5 voted for, no one voted against, and no one abstained. Thus, the decision to award to Rozov Vladimir Andreevich the degree of Candidate of Philology, Specialty 100222, Languages of Foreign Nations of Europe, Asia, Africa, Aborigines of America and Australia, Arabic, has been made. Dear colleagues, since our session was held with some council members working in the remote access mode, do council members or the degree applicant or others present have any questions or remarks regarding the procedure of today's session? I have to get answers from Vladimir Andreevich. No, I don't have any questions. But in the end, we'll have the opportunity to give some closing remarks. Is that right? Yes. Now, Mikhail Sergeyevich, you have any questions? No, I don't have any questions. No comments. Thank you. Yefim Anatolovich? No. Mikhail Anatolovich, any questions? No questions, no remarks. Professor Haminantila, you have any questions?
No questions.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. And finally, after all the formal, we are done with the formal part, let me give the floor to the applicant for his closing remarks. First of all, I would like to thank all the members of the Dissertation Council and all the speakers. This is a great honor and a great responsibility for me to be awarded to receive reviews about my work. I see its drawbacks very well, and I can see some points on which I should focus. The need to join the world discussion, to be more careful with the use of terms. And about epigraphics, I didn't want to say anything rude, so that was maybe a very strong. I have a greatest respect for this complex task, which has its own limitations because of that. I would like to thank everybody who assisted me and with whose assistance today's event became possible. My academic advisor, Oleg Ivanovich Redkin, and other employees of the university whom I have asked for help and support, Yefim Anatolovich Rezvan, Olga Mikhailovna Bernikova, Alexander Yuryevich Knish. I would like to say that without the university, Chamber of Curiosities, the Hermitage, and other institutions and organizations of this city, this work would be impossible. And I would like to thank my good fortune for writing this work here at this university, and moreover in the city. Separately, I would like to thank everybody who supported me in the course of my work, who bore with me, my parents, my family, my friends, my relatives, for which I am very grateful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Vladimir Andreevich. Now, let me, on behalf of everyone present, let me congratulate the applicant with being awarded the degree. Let's congratulate all of us. At that, let me announce our session closed. I thank everybody for your input, for this interesting discussion. Please stop online broadcasting. Thank you.